वेलकम टू मेरा संगीत पॉडकास्ट चैट एंड चाय विद कमल। और आज भी हम मुलाकातों के एक सफर पर चलते हैं। आज की ये मुलाकात कुछ वक्त पहले से। अक्सर हम आपसे क्लाइमेट चेंज के बारे बात करते हैं। क्लाइमेट चेंज के कारण दुनिया भर में बहुत सारी तब्दीलियां आई और बहुत सारे लोग कोशिशों में हैं कि किसी तरह से कुछ तो रिवर्स किया जा सके। हम अपने इकोलॉजी को, हम अपने एनवायरनमेंट को किस तरह से प्रोटेक्ट करके रख सकते हैं, किस तरह से कंजर्व कर सकते हैं, ऐसी कोशिशों में बहुत सारे लोग। एक नाम है प्रोफेसर कमल बावा का। एक डिस्टिंग्विश्ड प्रोफेसर हैं यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ मैसाचुसेट्स बॉस्टन में, साथ ही साथ फाउंडर हैं ऑफ द अशोका ट्रस्ट फॉर रिसर्च इन इकोलॉजी एंड द एनवायरनमेंट। उनके साथ बीते दिन हमारी एक मुलाकात हुई। विषय था कंजर्वेशन ऑफ इकोलॉजी एंड एनवायरनमेंट। सो उनका ये इंटरेस्ट कैसे शुरू हुआ कि इकोलॉजी और एनवायरनमेंट को कंजर्व किया जाए, इस बारे में चलिए उनसे जानते चलते हैं।
Very good. That's my favorite subject. And you see, my interest in conservation and in ecology arose when in 1962, I traveled to Eastern Himalaya as a first-year graduate student to undertake my PhD dissertation work. I had been out of Punjab. I had traveled to Western Himalaya by that time, but I have never been to the eastern part of the Himalayas. And what I saw was just amazing. Tremendous diversity of animal and plant species, very rich forests, and I was just completely blown away. I had never seen something like that. And from lowland rainforest to montane forest to alpine pastures, everything was so different and so rich. And I was just fascinated by that. And I think it was at that time I realized how rich the life is, how rich our biodiversity is. And biodiversity, as you know, refers to plant and animal species, different types of plant and animal species, ecological communities, rainforests, dry deciduous forests, deserts, grasslands, mangroves, oceans, they all constitute biodiversity. And at the same time, I also noticed there was very large-scale devastation of this diversity in the form of deforestation in the Eastern Himalaya. I will go to places, I'll see forests being clear-cut for a wide variety of purposes. And I was just surprised why we are doing it. I mean, what is the point? And of course, I understand, land is needed for various purposes, but one has to think about destroying nature indiscriminately very often. And so I became interested not only in biodiversity and deforestation as well. So after taking my doctorate degree, I came to America in 1967. I was first at the University of Washington, Seattle for a few years, and then I moved to Harvard. I got a very prestigious fellowship here at Harvard University for a couple of years, and then I joined University of Massachusetts, Boston.
Okay.
And here at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, I developed a very extensive program in Central America, where I started very systematic study of biodiversity of tropical rainforests there, and developed a long-term program. And I also saw a lot of deforestation. And then I was again reminded of deforestation in India. And at that time, I think deforestation just sort of stuck in my mind. And I moved from basic research to applied work in deforestation and focusing on how to conserve and manage forests, how to conserve and manage biodiversity. And in the 1980s, there was a very strong movement in the American academia to establish a new discipline called conservation biology. Many of us realize that we are working on conservation of wildlife, forest, oceans, but there was no holistic view of life, the richness of biodiversity. So I became a part of that academic movement to establish a new field of conservation biology. We formed a society for conservation biology. We started a journal, professional journal called Conservation Biology. I became the associate editor of that journal, and many universities started teaching courses in conservation biology. A very long answer to your short question, but I'll pause
But a
here.
very interesting one. You actually took me back to the Eastern Himalayas, which is so beautiful. But when you say Eastern Himalayas, would you like to specify Which state was it that you visited?
Very good question. I largely focused at that time, before my arrival here in America for my PhD dissertation, I largely focused on Darjeeling and Sikkim Himalaya. But I did travel to Meghalaya, to
Okay.
Shillong, and I went as far as Assam and Arunachal Pradesh.
आज हम बातें कर रहे हैं कंजर्वेशन ऑफ इकोलॉजी एंड एनवायरनमेंट। एक बहुत ही अहम विषय है ये, खास तौर पर इन दिनों जब हम क्लाइमेट चेंज के असर देखते चल रहे हैं विश्व भर में। ऐसे में ये बहुत लाजमी है कि हम सब कुछ न कुछ ऐसे कदम उठाएं जिससे कुछ तो रिवर्स हो सके। एक कोशिश ऐसी ही डिस्टिंग्विश्ड प्रोफेसर कमल बावा भी कर रहे हैं। उनका एक इनिशिएटिव है ATREE, द अशोका ट्रस्ट फॉर रिसर्च इन इकोलॉजी एंड द एनवायरनमेंट। सो इस इनिशिएटिव में क्या प्रोग्राम्स हैं और इसके बहुत सारे और पहलुओं के बारे अब प्रोफेसर कमल बावा हमें कुछ बताते चल रहे हैं।
I established ATREE in 1996 in India, and it was quite an effort in the sense, I had a full-time position here as a professor in the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and then trying to set up halfway across the world was not easy. It was very challenging. I started working in India again in 1991. Because I was always interested in sort of going back and doing a lot of work there. And then after 4 or 5 years of work there, largely in the Western Ghats, it occurred to me that India needs a very different type of institution to conserve its biodiversity, to conserve its nature, to conserve its natural capital. And there were 4 or 5 reasons to set up ATREE. It is ATREE. And one was that there was no institution that was looking at biodiversity as a whole. There were institutions for wildlife, forestry, plants, animals, but not the tremendous richness of life we have in our country. And second, you see, the loss of biodiversity has social, economic, human, and political dimensions. So all the institutions were approaching whatever they were doing from a scientific point of view. I felt an institution was needed that can look at social, economic, and political dimensions and the human dimensions of decline in biodiversity. And a third reason was that there were very serious policy issues in terms of how we conserve our natural heritage. And most of the institutions that were in this area of forestry or fisheries or oceans, they were government institutions. And they could not independently deal with the larger policy and institutional issues. And finally, there was no institution I felt that was producing the next generation of environmental leaders who have a very different type of thinking, who could think in terms of interdisciplinary approaches, combining natural and social sciences to address the very serious environmental challenges we were facing. So that was the reason I set up ATREE. Now, what does ATREE do? First, we are a knowledge institution. We are a science-based institution, both natural and social sciences. There are about 200 persons who are on the payroll. There are another 100 graduate students. So it's a fairly large organization. And I think people in Boston, certainly in the US, should be very proud of what ATREE is now, because I did all this thing while I was at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and based in Boston. And apart from our main office in Bangalore, we have 5 community conservation centers.
Okay.
In one line, I can say what our goal is. Our goal is to improve the environment and human condition in a country with a rapidly growing economy, shrinking natural capital. We are losing our natural capital. We all know that. And there are 1.4 billion people who are still very much dependent on this natural capital, especially in the rural areas and all that. And we have unique biodiversity. India occupies about 2% of the land area of the earth, but it has 12% of the global biodiversity. We have 4 hotspots of biodiversity. So I think we often don't realize how rich biodiversity we have. And so our institutional model to bring about this change, to improve the environment and to improve the human condition, rural communities that are so much dependent on natural resources are very unique. We are a combination of a think tank, a knowledge center, and as I mentioned, we have community conservation centers. So we function like a university department, an environmental think tank, and a grassroots organization, all rolled into one. And people have recognized that this is a very unique model. And very briefly, our programs are in exploration and conservation of biodiversity, in restoration. India has about 30% of the land degraded. How to restore this land to make it more productive. The third area is nature-based livelihoods. And finally, climate change. I think people can go and look at atreeusa.org or ATREE.org, which is the site for ATREE India. Look into more detail as to what we do.
Conservation of ecology and environment. इस विषय के बारे हम वक्त वक्त पर बहुत कुछ सुनते हैं, ये भी जानते हैं कि कुछ तो करना चाहिए, लेकिन शायद कुछ पलों के बाद फिर से हम अपनी जिंदगी में आगे बढ़ते चलते हैं, भूल से जाते हैं कि हम रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी को जिस तरह से व्यतीत कर रहे हैं, कहीं वो क्लाइमेट चेंज को बढ़ावा तो नहीं दे रहा। जब भी हम ऐसे विषयों के बारे में सुनते हैं या पढ़ते हैं, हमें लगता है कि हमें कुछ कदम उठाने चाहिए। सो कंजर्वेशन ऑफ इकोलॉजी एंड एनवायरनमेंट किस तरह से क्लाइमेट चेंज को रिवर्स कर सकता है? क्या पॉजिटिव इफेक्ट्स हो सकते हैं इकोलॉजी एंड एनवायरनमेंट को कंजर्व करने में? इस बारे में जानकारी लेते हैं। आज हमारे साथ हैं डिस्टिंग्विश्ड प्रोफेसर कमल बावा।
You see, very often people don't realize the deep connection between biodiversity and climate change. Biological systems, our oceans, mangroves, forests, grasslands, they suck up greenhouse gases. So when they are destroyed, we lose the capacity to reduce carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So the two issues are very much linked. And partly, I think we have this climate change because of fossil fuels, but also because we have destroyed nature at a very, very large scale during the last 50 or 60 years. India cannot aspire to be a third largest economic power unless we act as better stewards of our natural capital. That is declining. I think we all know that it is declining. Our air is unfit to breathe in almost all cities. Our rivers have dried up. And as I mentioned earlier, 30% of the land is degraded. Thus, sure, we can reverse the change. Yes, all of us will have to get involved in reversing this change. And we can reverse the change through nature-based solutions, through restoration, and then, of course, through other measures. And I also want to emphasize one more point. The climate change, it's not only climate change issue. Climate change also, and the biodiversity loss also involves the issue of environmental justice. Who suffers most from the loss of biological resources and climate change? It's the impoverished rural communities. And so it's not just the ecology we are concerned about. We are concerned about the deep connection between our environmental resources and people. And how do we simultaneously improve our environment, fight climate change, as well as improve, as I said earlier, the human condition in India, the issues of inequity, and so on and so forth. So I would like to appeal to your listeners to get involved with ATREE. We have a role for everybody, young or old, and just get in touch with me.
That's fantastic. So how do listeners get in touch with you?
kamal.bawa@gmail.com.
So ये बहुत ही दिलचस्प और बहुत ही इंफॉर्मेटिव कॉन्वर्सेशन रही प्रोफेसर कमल बावा के साथ। इसी के साथ इजाजत अपनी हमसफर कमल को। लौटूंगी मैं फिर एक और नए एपिसोड के साथ। So stay tuned in for more on Mera Sangeet Podcast.